When he walked into the courtroom, the air in the room changed. You think you've seen arrogance? Wait until you see an heir to a pharmaceutical fortune walk in, like it's his private office. He came down the center aisle as if he owned it. Designer sneakers, slim jacket, earbuds in, dark glasses under the fluorescent lights. The other defendants sat on wooden benches, tickets, and envelopes in their hands. He never glanced at them. At the clerk's desk, another name was being called. A man in a work jacket rose with his citation. The kid drifted past him, stopped at the front and said, "Flat and impatient. Let's get this over with." The room fell quiet. Conversations cut off. Paper stilled. Even the keyboard at the clerk's station stopped. Judge Caprio was finishing the case already in progress, voice calm, wrapping up thought about a missed meter and a reduced fine. Ordinary business. It stopped being ordinary the moment he noticed the stranger standing at the front. "You need to wait to be called," the clerk said, keeping her tone controlled. "Sir, please step back and come to the microphone when—" He didn't move, one hand in his pocket, the other wrapped around his phone. A faint hiss of music leaked from his earbuds. 2 minutes, he said. "I'm not here for a speech, just the ticket." No one smiled. "The microphone, please," the clerk repeated. He stepped forward when he was ready, not when she finished the sentence. Up close, his face was young, but his expression was old, the bored look of someone's to rooms bending around him. As he reached the stand, his hand adjusted on the phone. It was one small motion, half hidden by the angle of his wrist. Fingers curled, straightened, and for a heartbeat. The middle finger rose, aimed just enough toward the clerk to say exactly what it meant, low enough that he could deny it later. Most of the room missed it. Judge Caprio did not. His sentence to the man in the work jacket stopped mid-word. He lifted his eyes from the file and fixed them on the young man's hand, now resting loosely at his side, as if nothing had happened. The silence thickened. When Caprio spoke, his voice was level, almost gentle. "Young man," he said, "do you realize what you just did?" A muscle jumped along the kid's jaw. He rolled one shoulder, a practiced shrug. "No idea what you're talking about," he said. The words sounded light. The room heard the defiance. A low murmur ran through the benches. Older faces hardened. They might not know who he was, but they knew what they were looking at. Someone who believed rules were for other people. On the docket, it was a simple parking case. From the way the room was watching him now, everyone understood this was no longer just about where he'd left his car. He stood at the microphone as if it were beneath him, shoulders loose, chin lifted just enough to signal he didn't fear the man in the robe. But something in Judge Caprio's question had lodged under his skin. He shifted his weight almost imperceptibly. Before addressing the citation, Caprio folded his hands and spoke as though they were the only two people in the room. "Tell me who you are. Not the name on the ticket. Not the address. Who you are." A woman in the second row leaned toward her husband. Not loudly, but loud enough for the row behind her. "Isn't that the kid whose father hiked up insulin prices? The one who was all over the news?" The whisper wasn't malicious. It was recognition, the kind that lands like a stone. The young man heard it. His jaw tightened for a second. Not outrage. Something closer to embarrassment, quickly buried. The clerk was gathering the next stack of files when a folder slipped from her hand and hit the floor with a soft thud. Papers fluttered outward. For the briefest instant, he leaned forward, as if instinct told him to help. But the moment collapsed. Hess straightened, let the impulse die, and watched her crouch to pick them up. Caprio saw that too. The judge took a slow breath. "You've had advantages," he said carefully. "Schools most kids can't afford to walk past. Drivers, advisors. I imagine you never needed to stand in a government building and wait your turn." The kid's mouth twitched, caught between smirk and flinch. A man in the back muttered. "Must be nice," another answered. "Until it isn't," Caprio continued, not accusing, simply observing. There were incidents before this, weren't there? The young man's stillness was its own confession. The judge didn't need details. The city's public record painted its own picture. A fight in a school parking lot at 16. No charges filed after a single phone call. Trespassing on private property at 18. Misunderstanding. Dismissed by morning. Each time, the story evaporated before reaching daylight. It wasn't that he believed himself invincible. It was that the world had taught him consequences were negotiable. Yet the arrogance he wore now didn't quite fit him. It felt too polished, too practiced, like a coat borrowed from someone older, heavier. Under it, a different kind of tension flickered. Quiet, restless, defensive. Caprio leaned back slightly. "You walked in here today as though none of this matters. But people who truly don't care don't react the way you did a moment ago." The kid's eyes narrowed, unsure whether he was being challenged or understood. "Before we deal with your violation," Caprio said, voice steady as a held note, "we need to talk about something more important. We need to talk about the persons standing in front of me." For the first time, the young man hesitated, not theatrically, but like someone whose footing had shifted without warning. No one in his life had ever asked him that question, without an agenda attached. Not his father. Not his teachers. Not the lawyers who smoothed the rough edges of his behavior. They told him what he represented, what he owed, what he should be. But who he was. That was territory he avoided as carefully as other people avoided cliffs. He swallowed. Barely. The courtroom saw a crack, thin but unmistakable, and the tension in the room changed again. Not anger, now. Not judgment. Something closer to anticipation, as if everyone sensed this was the first moment of the day, when the mask he lived behind might slip. Caprio let the silence sit for a breath, and then another. "Before we talk about the ticket," he said softly, "let's talk about who you are." The boy who had entered the courtroom like a conqueror suddenly looked very small in a space built for truth. He didn't answer. Not because he refused, because he didn't know where to start. The silence stretched just long enough for the room to lean in. Judge Caprio opened the ticket file with a deliberate calm. "Let's begin with something simple," he said. "Why was your car parked in that driveway at that hour?" The question landed like a stone dropped into still water. A flicker crossed the young man's face, too fast for most to see, but not for the judge. He shifted his gaze toward the back wall, searching for a neutral point to anchor himself. "I wasn't driving," he said. Quick. Rehearsed. A shield, rather than an answer. Caprio didn't respond with anger. He simply lifted a printed frame from the evidence packet and set it upright on the bench. "Providence cameras are very clear," he said. "This is you behind the wheel. Same jacket, same plates." A faint ripple moved through the benches, soft disbelief mixed with satisfaction. 4 years, many in that room had watched wealthy families slip past accountability like smoke. Seeing a lie crumble under plain evidence carried a quiet charge. His throat tightened. His eyes darted to the picture, then away, as though the still image accused him more harshly than any human voice. An older man whispered, "Told you he'd lie." A woman beside him murmured, "They always think no one's watching." The young man's chin dipped, not in shame, yet, but in the recognition that his usual exits had been sealed. Caprio continued, "Do you know whose driveway you blocked?" "I don't care," he said, too fast again. But the hardness in his tone didn't match the tremor at its edge. The judge's next words cut cleanly through the room. It belonged to an elderly woman returning from cancer treatment. The benches fell still. No one reached for their phone. No one shifted. Even the kid's breath seemed hostile. Caprio didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. She was trying to get home. Her legs were unsteady from the therapy. She had to wait in the car until her neighbor come to move her. A low, aching sound left someone in the third row. A grandmother, hand pressed to her chest. For her generation, illness wasn't an abstraction. It was memory, fear, history. The young man's posture stiffened. For the first time, his expression wasn't guarded. It was startled, almost cornered. "That has nothing to do with me," he burst out. But the words broke in the middle, fractured by something he didn't manage to hide. Anger wasn't his default. It was his armor. Caprio studied him carefully. Something deeper than frustration sat behind the boy's eyes, a weight that didn't belong to a parking dispute. The judge closed the folder softly. "You chose that spot. You chose to ignore the impact on someone who was fighting to stay alive." He paused. "Why?" The young man's hands clenched at his sides. His breathing was uneven. Not loud, but strained, like someone holding back a wave he wasn't prepared for. He looked down, then up, then away again, caught in a silent battle between pride and something more fragile. His voice, when he spoke, was barely there. "You don't understand." Caprio leaned slightly forward. "Then help me." The challenge wasn't hostile. It was an invitation, one the young man wasn't ready for and couldn't walk away from. The courtroom felt smaller now, as though walls and benches and people had drawn closer, compressing the space around him. This wasn't the script he'd expected. This wasn't a scolding he could shrug off or a fine he could pay. This was a steady, patient pressure aimed at the truth he had spent months avoiding. The judge placed his hands flat on the bench. "Young man," he said, voice low and unwavering, "we're not done. Not even close." A hush fell so deep, the hum of the fluorescent light seemed loud. Everyone felt it. The pivot, the gathering weight. Something bigger than a parking violation was about to break the surface. Judge Caprio reached for a thin envelope that had been resting beneath the main file, one the young man clearly hadn't expected to see. The judge held it with the same care someone might give a fragile photograph. "This arrived yesterday," he said quietly. "Submitted anonymously. I'd like you to look at the signature." He unfolded the document and turned it toward the young man. It wasn't long. Just a single-page medical note stating the condition of the woman whose driveway he had blocked. At the bottom was the date of her passing, not the cause, not an accusation. Only the stark line marking the day her body finally stopped fighting. She died the morning after the incident. More rippled through the courtroom, not outrage, but sorrow. The kind that grips older faces first, people who understood hospitals, late-night phone calls, and the slow cruelty of terminal illness. Caprio asked, "Did you know?" The boy didn't blink, didn't breathe. His shoulders sank by an inch, barely visible unless you were watching closely. Then he nodded, small, reluctant, but undeniable. The air went brittle. This wasn't the arrogance of someone flaunting power. It was the defensiveness of someone cornered by a guilt he hadn't known how to carry. The judge didn't pounce. "How long have you known?" he asked, voice gentle but precise. The young man swallowed. "A few weeks," he whispered. "I read it online. Someone tagged me in a post." He didn't elaborate. He didn't have to. The courtroom could fill in the rest. The comments, the blame, the strangers pointing fingers at the son of a man already infamous for the price of a life-saving drug. Grief mixed with resentment until he couldn't tell one from the other. Caprio placed the paper down. "Your reaction earlier, the attitude, isn't anger at the world," he said. "It's anger at yourself." The words struck him like a blow he didn't expect. His chin trembled once before he locked it still. Before the judge could continue, a man in the last row rose. Middle-aged, suit a little too tight for his frame, grief etched into the lines around his eyes. "Judge," he said, "may I say something?" Caprio nodded. The man walked forward, stopping only a few feet behind the boy. "My sister was the woman you blocked," he said softly. "I asked for leniency in my statement. I didn't want him punished." The room shifted. People leaned in, bracing for anger, accusation, something sharp. Instead, the man's voice broke with gentleness. She wouldn't have blamed him. She fought that illness for months. He didn't cause what happened. The young man's shoulders curled inward. He didn't look at the man. Couldn't. She got frustrated easily near the end, the brother continued. She would have said he was just a kid who made a dumb decision. "Nothing more," gasps whispered through the courtroom, not from shock, but from the quiet, disarming power of compassion in a place built for judgment. The boy exhaled shakily, as though something inside him finally cracked open. Caprio spoke again, low and steady. "Your behavior these past months has nothing to do with entitlement," he said. "You're grieving, and grief has a way of twisting itself into things we don't recognize." The young man's face tightened. His voice was a rasp. "You don't know what it's like." Caprio's eyes softened. "Your mother," he said, "passed 2 years ago. The records say it was the same diagnosis." The boy froze. He wasn't hiding behind arrogance anymore. He was hiding behind pain, raw, unprocessed, and too big for someone his age to navigate alone. His voice, when he finally found it, was the smallest sound he'd made all morning. "Yeah," he whispered. "Same thing." A silence settled, heavy but not hostile. The courtroom wasn't an audience now. It was a witness to a truth he'd spent years outrunning. He stepped back from the mic, chest trembling. He opened his mouth, maybe to defend himself, maybe to attack, maybe to run. But instead he said 2 words no one expected. "I'm sorry." Not shouted, not rehearsed, just real, and impossibly quiet. The apology lingered in the room like a fragile echo, unexpected and unpolished. Noon rushed to fill the silence. It settled over the benches, softening even the sternest expressions. Judge Caprio rested his hands on the bench and leaned back slightly, his voice dropping to a tone that carried not authority, but understanding. "Listen to me," he said. "This isn't about a fine, and it's not about a driveway. This is about what pain does to us when we don't know where to put it." The young man blinked hard, as if trying to clear something from his vision. He didn't speak, but the rigid set of his shoulders loosened by a fraction. Caprio continued. "Your father built an empire on numbers, calculations, margins, projections. A world where people become data points. That world has its own pressures, its own blind spots." He paused. "But you're not standing here as a column on a spreadsheet. You're standing here as a human being, and that matters more than whatever legacy someone expects you to carry." A low, thoughtful murmur drifted through the room. Older listeners, absorbing something they themselves had learned the hard way. That grief ignored becomes anger, and anger misdirected becomes destruction. The young man finally looked up, eyes rimmed with exhaustion. "I didn't sleep 4 days after I read about her," he said, voice barely audible. "I kept seeing my mom in that driveway, waiting, weak. I thought, if I hadn't parked there, maybe." He stopped, breath catching. "I know it's not my fault. I know that. But it felt the same, like I failed someone again." The honesty stunned the courtroom. People who had walked in ready to condemn him now watched him with something closer to recognition, because nearly everyone in that room had, at some point, carried a loss that refused to stay where it belonged. A woman with silver hair in the front row leaned forward. Her voice was gentle, but firm. "That boy doesn't need punishment," she said. "He needs support." The young man turned toward the sound, startled. For the first time that morning, his expression wasn't defensive. It was bewildered, like someone realizing he wasn't alone. Caprio nodded slowly. "She's right," he said. "What you've carried, no one your age should navigate that alone. But the world won't get kinder just because you're hurting. You have to choose what kind of man you'll be in the middle of it." He opened the ticket file one last time, though everyone knew his decision wasn't hiding in the paperwork. "I'm dismissing the fines," Caprio said simply. "All of them." A ripple of surprise swept the room, not from disagreement, but from the weight of what the judge was choosing to do. "No penalties," Caprio added. "No fees. No punishment." The young man's breath left him in a silent exhale, equal parts relief and disbelief. "But," the judge continued, raising a single finger, "there is something I expect from you. Not as a condition, as an opportunity." The room leaned in. "You will volunteer at the cancer center for 50 hours, he said. "Not because you owe anyone. Not because of guilt. But because you need to understand what strength looks like up close. You need to see the courage of people who fight every day with less support than you've ever imagined." He waited a beat. "And you need to see yourself in a place where compassion isn't a weakness. It's the only thing keeping people upright." The young man didn't hesitate. No bravado, no eye rolls, no deflection. "Yes," he said. The word came out steady. "I'll do it." He wasn't agreeing out of fear. He was agreeing because, for the first time in a long time, he understood what he'd been running from, and what he needed to run toward. A quiet, collective breath moved across the courtroom. The same people who had bristled when he cut the line now watched him with something softer. Not forgiveness. Something deeper. Recognition. Humanity. Caprio closed the folder with a quiet click. "Then let's start from there," he said. And for the first time that morning, the young man stood without bracing himself, as though the weight he had carried in with him had finally shifted, leaving space for something new to grow. He stepped away from the microphone as though the ground beneath him had changed, lighter in some places, unsteady in others. The courtroom was quiet, not with tension now, but with the kind of silence that follows a soul-level shift. People weren't watching him as a spectacle anymore. They were watching a crossroads. He reached the aisle, took 2 steps toward the door, then stopped. Something pulled him back. He turned, walked slowly to the mic, and the room held its breath once more. "Judge," he said, voice careful, almost fragile. "I don't want to be who my father wants me to be." It wasn't rebellion. It wasn't theater. It was confession. A young man finally speaking aloud the fear he'd carried like a second spine. Caprio's face softened, a warmth settling into the lines carved by decades on the bench. He didn't raise his voice, yet every syllable reached the back row with clarity. "Then don't," he said. "The world doesn't need another CEO. It needs a decent man." The words hung there, steady and undeniable. Not advice, not judgment. A calling. Even the clerk paused mid-keystroke, hands hovering above the keyboard, as if interrupting would break something sacred. The boy swallowed, the truth of the statement hitting him deeper than anything said that morning. He nodded once, a small, solemn vow to himself, more than anyone else. Just as he stepped away for good, a sharp vibration hummed in his pocket. His phone. He glanced at the screen. The name glowing back at him made his breath hitch. Dad. Every muscle in his body tensed. It was the same call tone that had dictated his schools, his image, his apologies, his silences. The same call tone that had swept away consequences and replaced them with expectations he never asked for. The room saw the way he froze, the way his thumb hovered over the screen, torn between old habits and the new voice that had just been planted inside him. For a moment, he stood suspended between two futures. Then, with a small but steady motion, he pressed. Ignore. A quiet, almost reverent murmur rippled across the benches. No one cheered. Noon clapped. But a few people straightened in their seats, recognizing the courage in that simple gesture. For many of them, parents, grandparents, it was a moment. They wished someone in their own family had lived. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and walked toward the exit, not quickly, not theatrically, just deliberately, as someone choosing his direction for the first time. No guards followed, no reporters waited, just the slow creak of the door and the soft shuffle of older feet shifting to watch him leave. Behind him, the courtroom remained standing in silence, not out of shock, out of respect, for the rare sight of a young man making a decision his future self would thank him for. As the door closed, the narrator's voice rose, steady and thoughtful. We come to court for verdicts, but we leave with lessons. And that young man, judging by the way he silenced his phone, had just taken the first step toward becoming someone he wasn't afraid to face. A beat of contemplative quiet, then a final subtle note, an open door toward another chapter. In 3 months, he will walk back into this courtroom, but not as a violator, as someone returning to show who he chose to become. And with that, the story didn't end. It simply began to echo.